good evening again. I have the pleasure of preaching tonight. We're going to be in Exodus chapter 31. We're going to be finishing up the section with the instructions for building the tabernacle. It's exciting to be here. It is the very first week of Black History Month, and so, of course, Mark is on vacation. I hope he sees that. Tonight I'm going to be talking about the topic of rest. And as we prepare ourselves to dive into this topic, I had a question for you guys. Why are grown-ups always so tired? Right? Does anybody remember being a child and having just kind of boundless energy and enthusiasm for the world, and then as you age, as you get a little older, you just get a little tired, right? Kind of consistently, always tired. If you asked me how I was doing, my answer would probably be good, but it might also be I'm a little bit tired. And I think that's a common experience. I don't think I'm the only one who feels that way often. And part of it might be lifestyle, right? Maybe you got to exercise regularly, sleep well, don't eat snacks late at night. All of those things contribute to tiredness. Part of it is just you get older and your body breaks down, all that kind of stuff. But I think part of it is this weariness that comes from carrying the weight of life, right? This kind of general weariness that comes from the fact that the older you get, the more complicated things seem to be, right? The problems of life don't get simpler with age. If anything, as you see things more clearly, they seem to be more complicated. Relationships can become more difficult. Things that you thought were easy actually end up being kind of hard. They fracture, they break down. You watch your heroes fail. The institution that you trusted betrays you. You lose people, and you carry that grief with you for the rest of your life. These things become more and more common, and maybe worst of all, you begin to let yourself down. You begin to see ways in which you're not living like the person you thought you were going to be. You're not accomplishing the goals you set for yourself. If we're honest, we don't live up to the standards we set for ourselves, much less someone else's standards. And I think we carry all this weight, and it makes us tired. Well, tonight's message is about rest. It's about our need for rest and how to truly find rest. I hope that it is a blessing for you. The main idea, in case you want to take a nap during this sermon, the main idea is that rest is a sacred reminder of the faithfulness of God. Let me say that again. Rest is a sacred reminder of the faithfulness of God. Like I said, we're going to be in Exodus chapter 31, looking at verses 12 to the end of the chapter, to verse 18. And these are the end of God's instructions for how to build the tabernacle. For the past several weeks, we've been going through these instructions for how the tabernacle should be built, what the ingredients are supposed to be, what the priests are supposed to wear, even who's supposed to build it. And at the end of this, we have these maybe surprising instructions. The very last thing in this section on the design of the tabernacle is this reminder of God's command to Sabbath rest. These Sabbath commands of regular rest. And I think we can see as we look at this in that context that it is a reminder that rest is sacred and it points us to the faithfulness of God. Let me read Exodus chapter 31, verses 12 to 18. And the Lord said to Moses, "You are to speak to the people of Israel and say, 'Above all you shall keep my Sabbaths. For this is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I, the Lord, sanctify you. You shall keep the Sabbath because it is holy for you. Everyone who profanes it shall be put to death. Whoever does any work on it, that soul shall be cut off from among the people. 6 days shall work be done, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of solemn rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath shall be put to death. Therefore, the people of Israel shall keep the Sabbath, observing the Sabbath throughout their generations as a covenant forever. It is a sign forever between me and the people of Israel that in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, and on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed.'" And he gave to Moses, when he had finished speaking with him on Mount Sinai, the 2 tablets of the testimony, tablets of stone, written with the finger of God. Please join me in prayer. Dear Lord, I pray that tonight we could experience true rest as we learn about, as we celebrate the faithfulness that you have shown us. Lord, I pray that your Spirit would be at work in our hearts and our minds, so that as your word is implanted, we could be transformed to love you more and follow you more faithfully. I pray all these things in your Son's name. Amen. So the first thing I want to talk about tonight is this idea of rest as a sacred gift. That rest is actually a part of God's design for creation. See, if we look in Exodus 31, verse 15 that I just read, we hear these instructions to rest. 6 days shall work be done, but the 7th day is a Sabbath of solemn rest, holy to the Lord. That word Sabbath shares the same root in the Hebrew as the word rest. It's a special day of rest, holy to the Lord. And this command to rest on the 7th day is woven throughout the book of Exodus. We actually see it show up 4 times. We see it when God gives the 10 commandments as one of the first commandments. We see it a couple of chapters later in chapter 23 as God is instructing his people how they should treat each other, this reminder that they need to provide each other rest. We see it here in 31 at the close of the tabernacle instructions, and then when they actually get around to building the tabernacle in chapter 35, we see this command again, over and over again, this command to rest. And this command to Sabbath rest is drawn from the very pattern of creation. In Genesis 1 and 2, God creates the world in 6 days, and as a culmination of that creative work, on the 7th day, he rests. And so he calls his people to mirror that pattern with their weekly day of rest called the Sabbath. It's really cool when he includes this command here at the end of the tabernacle section. He's actually drawing a straight line between the creation of the world and the creation of the tabernacle. The creation of the world is divided in 7 parts, with the 7th being rest, and the instructions for the tabernacle are divided into these 7 sections where God says something to Moses, with the final one being rest, showing the tabernacle as a shadow of these greater spiritual realities as wide as all of creation. And as a part of that reality, as a part of that plan, is rest for God's people. And you have to wonder, why would God do this? Well, I think that God created us with limits, like our need for rest, so that we could depend on him. Have you ever thought about that? I think sometimes when we imagine heaven, we imagine that it's going to be us with boundless, infinite power, able to do whatever we want. And I really don't think that's the picture that we should have in our head. Not that there will be any pain or suffering, but we won't be able to we won't necessarily have superpowers, right? We will still be these limited, finite creatures, because that's a fundamental part of who God created us to be. He created us with limits that we cannot overcome. One limit that I faced in my life is my height. My license says that I'm 5'11", and it's really close to true. It depends on the shoes I'm wearing. And my entire life, I have wanted to be able to dunk a basketball. Back in the peak of my athletic career in high school, I could get 2 hands on the rim, but I could never quite get high enough to dunk a basketball. That is a hard limit in my life. God has created me with that limit. He did not make me any taller. He didn't make me any better at jumping. I cannot overcome that limit. But that's not necessarily a flaw, right? He didn't fail to make me correctly. He just made me with these certain limits. Our need for rest is one of these limits. You know, in your lifetime, you're going to spend an average of 26 years asleep. That's a lot of time. We all have to rest. If we work too long or too hard, we pass out because we need rest. This is a way in which we are not like God. God is limitless. He never tires. He never needs to rest. In fact, when we use fancy theology language, we'll talk about the communicable and the incommunicable attributes of God. Those communicable attributes are those ways in which he is like us. He's loving, he's just, he's wise, and we can, in some sense, share in those attributes. But his incommunicable attributes are those that are only true of him, that are not true of us. He is all-powerful. We are not. He is all-knowing. We are not. He is eternal. We are not. God is limitless. He's infinite. But we were created with limits. And I think that's a really good thing. See, our limits are an opportunity to trust in God. Because we have limits, we get to trust him. We get to know him as a provider. Some of the most limited people you'll ever meet are children. I love them, they're great, but they have clear limits. There are a lot of things they cannot do for themselves that you have to do for them. And because of those limitations, it creates a beautiful relationship with their parents, a beautiful relationship of trust and dependence, of intimacy with their parents. It's expressed in Psalm 131. David writes this psalm from the perspective of a child. I want to read it for you. It's only like 3 verses. O Lord, my spirit is not lifted up. My eyes are not raised too high. I do not occupy myself with things too great and too marvelous for me. But I have calmed and quieted my soul like a weaned child with its mother. Like a weaned child is my soul within me. O Israel, hope in the Lord from this time forth and forevermore. The imagery the psalmist uses there is that of a child that has just finished feeding, that has fallen asleep in its mother's arms. That type of intimacy and trust is what we can experience with God, because where we have limits, he does not. Because we have needs that only he can provide. We can have this nearness to God because he has designed us to need him. So it's actually a good thing that we need rest. It's an opportunity to trust God, to come to him and say, God, I can't carry this weight. I need you to do it. I've done all I can for today. Let me lie down and get some sleep. And we can, because he is on the throne. So our need for rest it's a feature, not a bug. It's a gracious gift from God. And I think we really need to remember this, because in our culture, in our day and age, I think we often feel like it's not okay to have limits. Like we are failing if we can't handle everything the world throws at us. If we can't carry the weight of the world on our shoulders, we feel like we have not done enough or we've failed in some way. But that's not true. We were created to have limits. It's okay to need help. It's okay to need to rely on God or the people that God has placed in your life. We create this false vision of maturity as total independence. Because it's true that as a child grows, they should become less dependent on their parents. They should start paying their own bills. They should start living in their own home. But that's not true for children of God. We don't become less dependent on God as we grow in faith. We become more. We need him more. We experience more joy trusting him, relying on him. So if you feel like you can't handle the weight of the world, you're right. And that's okay. It's okay to have limits. It's okay to be human. And we shouldn't abuse this principle. We shouldn't not work, right? The recipe God made was 6 parts work, 1 part rest. But some of us feel guilty when we take a day off. Some of us pack our lives so full that we end up burning out. Regular rhythms of rest are so important. Regular rhythms of rest are so important that God made the Sabbath day holy. That's what he says in verse 14. He says, "You shall keep the Sabbath because it is holy for you. Everyone who profanes it shall be put to death. Whoever does any work on it, that soul shall be cut off from among his people." So God took 1 day out of the week and he made it holy. This idea of holiness is one that we use often in church, one that we see all over the book of Exodus. And basically what it means is to be separate from ordinary things so that you can be set apart for a specific purpose. right? Separate from and set apart for. That's holiness in a nutshell. For example, sometimes married couples will have a date night. Maybe like the second Tuesday of every month is date night. That one night is separate from all the other nights of the month, and it's set aside for this specific purpose of strengthening their relationship, right? It's separate from, set apart for. Or my favorite example is a toothbrush as something that we treat as holy. It's separate from all the other brushes in your house. I don't use my toothbrush to clean my hair. I don't use my toothbrush to clean my toilet. It is separate from ordinary use and set apart only for the job of cleaning my teeth. Can I get an amen? I didn't think I could. That's fine. I'll try again later. That's holiness, right? And so God made the Sabbath holy. It is separate from the other 6 days of the week in which work is done and is set apart for the worship of God. In that sense, it's actually a lot like the tabernacle. The tabernacle was this holy place in the midst of God's people. It was separate from all the other places, and it was set apart so that God could be worshiped there. The Sabbath, if the tabernacle is a holy space, the Sabbath was holy time. It was 1 day a week set apart specifically for the worship of God. So God reserved 1 day out of their week for worship and for rest. And there were these strict prohibitions on what kind of work could be done on the Sabbath. Right? They couldn't gather sticks, they couldn't light fires. Everyone was included in this day of rest. In earlier in chapter 23, earlier in chapter 23, there is this very clear instruction that everybody gets a day off, including the slaves, including the immigrants. Everyone in this community would get to rest on that day. And it served as a time to worship God. God was so serious about this command they would rest on the Sabbath that to break it was a capital offense. He literally said, "Rest once a week or I will kill you." He takes his holiness seriously. We see similar rules when they approach the foot of Mount Sinai. God says, let not even an animal touch this mountain or it will be put to death. And you got to ask, why would God take it this seriously? I think a lot of times when I hear people talk about Sabbaths kind of colloquially, they really highlight this idea of you need a day off, you need to rest, and that's true, we need rest. But if it was just about what you needed, then the fact that God threatens your life if you don't comply would seem like overkill, right? See, I think that we miss the picture when we make the Sabbath just about human needs and not about the worship of God. See, the Sabbath is about God. The heart of this commandment is worship, not self-care. Self-care is great. I think it's great. You should take care of yourself, sleep well, exercise, get some sun, have a smoothie, do all of that self-care stuff. But the Sabbath was not just about self-care, it was about worshiping God. It was about resting from normal work so that you can worship. That's what is at the heart of the Sabbath. It was for them, it was for the Israelites, but it wasn't about them. It was for them, not about them. Just like the tabernacle was created for the Israelites, but it celebrated God, the Sabbath was for them, but its purpose was worship. Like so much of the Old Covenant law, it was a gift to God's people, but it was about God, not about them. See, it's more than just a day off. We're not obligated to keep the Sabbath like they did, just like we're not obligated to worship at the tabernacle. But when we take these rhythms of rest that I think we should in our life, make sure they're about God. If you set aside time in your week to rest, make sure you are resting in worship. Don't forget to worship on your Sabbath. Don't just spend the day watching Netflix or doom scrolling on Instagram. Actually worship God. So we've talked about this idea of a Sabbath, but how is the Sabbath actually about God? Like, how does that actually make sense? He gave them this day as a sacred gift, an opportunity to rest, to trust in Him, an obligation to worship. But how does it actually work? What's this connection between rest and worship? Well, my next point in this sermon is that not only is it a sacred gift, but it is an enduring reminder that rest is a memorial to God's faithfulness. It's a memorial. So in verses 13 and 17, we see this language that God uses to talk about the Sabbath. He calls it a sign between me and you throughout your generations. He calls this one day of the week a sign throughout their generations. What he means by that is a sign or a reminder given to them so that they would remember something. It was a Memorial Day. We have a holiday in America called Memorial Day. It's in May, and it's a day that we set aside to commemorate, to honor soldiers who have died for our country, right? We take the day off if you work for the federal government or companies that observe that day so that we can honor those who have given their lives. We create memorials like that, holidays like that, to help us remember important things, right? We create monuments and memorials and holidays to commemorate things that are important to us in our culture. And the Sabbath was for them a weekly holiday, a weekly day of remembrance to God. It was a holy day filled with the worship of God. It wasn't just a weekend. So for example, we recently celebrated Martin Luther King Day. It's a great day. Recently, I've heard more and more people advocate that you should take that day as a day of service. It's not just a day that you get to yourself to catch up on sleep or do chores around your house, but you should go and volunteer and serve. That's how a lot of people celebrate that day. Personally, I think that Martin marched so that I could sit down, but other people see it differently. And I think that Sabbath was like that. It was a day that was set aside for the worship of God. It wasn't just about sleeping. It was about worship. Now, why does that matter? See, I think that we need these reminders of important things. We are prone to forget important things. Right? We celebrate victories, we commemorate losses so that future generations won't forget what has come before, what lessons we have learned. And so the Sabbath became both an opportunity to remember and to proclaim what God had done for his people. Part of the reason why I think we need these memorials, these tangible reminders, is because we don't need to just engage our minds, but we need to engage our hearts. Right? Like I think that we need to do things or to not do things so that our hearts become engaged in the worship of God. It's not about just learning something one time, but what you remember all the time that shapes how you feel, how you act, what you worship. For example, often in wedding ceremonies, a couple will exchange rings. They'll have this ring on their finger as a tangible, visible reminder of the promise that they made. I am confident that most people, if they forgot to wear their wedding ring, would not forget that they were married. Right? They wouldn't be like, oh, I forgot about that day. That was crazy. Like they would remember, but they carry the ring with them always as a tangible reminder, a constant memorial to the promise that they have made. It was this same way that the Sabbath was supposed to function, a day, a sign throughout their generations to remember God. Now, what was this specifically about? What were they supposed to remember? I would argue that it was God's faithfulness, that it was the finished work of God that they were remembering. See, God is faithful to finish his work. We see twice in this passage 2 times where it references the work that God has finished. First, in verse 13, it talks about how they will know that God sanctifies them, that he makes them holy. And then in verse 17, it says that they will remember that in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and earth, and that on the 7th day he rested and was refreshed, that he finished his work of creation. You see, the very first Sabbath was the 7th day of creation when God finished making all things good. You know, you wouldn't hire a contractor if you knew that he didn't finish his jobs, right? If you knew that he came in, he took out the drywall and just left it a mess. Like if someone didn't actually complete the work that you were paying them for, you wouldn't hire them to do it again. Whereas if they were trustworthy, you might even recommend them to your friends. Well, God has a reputation as someone who finishes the things that he starts. He didn't sit down and get halfway through the work of creation and then go and take a break. He finished what he started. He was faithful to finish his work. And in the same way, God is the one who made his people holy. When it talks about him sanctifying them, it's not just him recognizing them as holy, it's him rescuing them from slavery in Egypt so that they could be devoted to his worship as his people. That's what the whole book of Exodus is about. He rescues them from slavery in Egypt. He brings them to Mount Sinai to form a covenant with him, and he delivers them to his promised land. He chooses them out of all of the families of the world to be holy to him. This is the work of God sanctifying his people, and it's foundational to their identity. So the Sabbath was to be this memorial day to the finished work of God, that he finished creation, that he was faithful to make everything good, and that he was faithful to rescue his people and bring them to himself so that they could be holy. See, we need to remember that God is faithful to finish his work. The Israelites were these people in transition. They had seen these miracles. They had been rescued. They had been promised this beautiful land, and yet they were not there yet. They were in the wilderness. Harsh conditions, fully reliant, dependent on God for food, for water. They needed a regular reminder that God finishes what he starts. That he would not just take them from slavery in Egypt and leave them in the wilderness to die. He was faithful to create the world. He was faithful to make them holy. He will finish what he starts. There is nothing that God begins that he does not carry to completion. There is no promise that he makes that he does not fulfill. See, when we look to the past faithfulness of God, we can have confidence that he will continue to be faithful. The best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. That's just true for most people in most situations. If you want to know how someone's going to behave in the future, well, look what they did in the past. Yes, people can grow and change, but typically the best predictor of past behavior, of future behavior, is past behavior. Well, look at what God has done. Look at how he has been faithful. We can trust him to be faithful again because we have this memorial, this reminder that God finishes his work. See, I think we need this regular reminder of rest because it protects us. It protects us from idolatry. The first time this Sabbath command appears in Exodus, it's in the midst of these other commands against idolatry. No other gods before me, no graven images. Honor the Sabbath day and keep it holy. And I think the reason why it's there is because work can so easily become an idol. Work can so easily become something we trust in more than God. When we ignore our limitations, when we work and don't rest, we try and take the place of God. We try to be limitless like him when he has created us to be dependent on him. Refusal to rest is a refusal to trust that God will keep his promises and finish his work. God has promised to provide for his people. We saw this in the tabernacle with the bread of the presence. We saw this earlier with the manna from heaven. We see this in the Gospel of Matthew, where Jesus reminds us that he cares for the birds of the air and the flowers of the field. When we reject his gift of rest, we are refusing to trust that he will provide what we need. It turns us into a slave to the idol of work. Let me read this quote from a book by Tim Keller called Every Good Endeavor. Anyone who cannot obey God's command to observe the Sabbath is a slave, even a self-imposed one. Your own heart or our materialistic culture or an exploitative organization or all of the above will be abusing you if you don't have the ability to be disciplined in your practice of the Sabbath. Sabbath is therefore a declaration of our freedom It means you are not a slave, not to your culture's expectations, your family's hopes, your medical school's demands, not even to your own insecurities. See, God keeps his promises. If he is the one who sanctifies you, then you can rest. And a regular discipline of rest will help protect your heart from idolatry. See, we aren't bound to keep the Sabbath like they were in Bible times. We aren't bound to not work on Saturday and not collect sticks or light fires. But we are at risk of the same idols that they were. We are at risk of turning our work, our effort into an idol and failing to trust God. If you can't rest, work might be an idol. We are called to live out of the freedom as believers that we have as believers, and that means resting in Christ. See, true rest can only be found in Jesus. And the Sabbath rest that we've been talking about finds its fulfillment in Christ. My last point for the evening is this, that we've been given a rest for the people of God. There is true rest in Jesus. See, the Sabbath finds its true fulfillment in the work of Jesus Christ. God's faithfulness is seen most powerfully in the finished work of Christ on the cross. Through Christ's life, death, and resurrection, God showed his faithfulness to redeem his people, to finish the work of salvation. When the Sabbath is first introduced, it points us to these 7 days of creation. And then later it points us to Israel's rescue from Egypt. But now we can look to a greater work of redemption, a greater accomplishment, a greater sign of God's faithfulness, the cross of Christ. Just as God finished creation and rescued his people from slavery, he has purchased redemption for us through the death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. In that book by Keller I mentioned, he talks about this idea of the work beneath the work. That beneath this work that we all do, there is this existential feeling that we cannot satisfy, that we cannot accomplish enough. See, we are all born under the curse of sin. And no matter how hard we work, we cannot overcome it. We cannot prove ourselves righteous. We cannot earn our own salvation. We can't be good enough. Apart from Christ, we will strive ceaselessly and never know true rest. But because of the great love that God has for us, he sent Jesus to live a perfect life, to die in our place, and to be raised from the dead so that any who place their faith in him will be saved. See, we all labor beneath this work, beneath the work, and it is only through the gospel that we can truly rest, that we can set down our burdens when we look to our work to sanctify us, to make us holy before God. But it will never satisfy. Only through the gospel can we be at peace. Only through the gospel can we truly know rest. See, if you're enslaved to the idol of work, the solution is not just a day off, but it's the true freedom that comes from the gospel. If your work fills you with anxiety or fear, or if you can't take a day off because it's too important or you feel too important, seek the freedom that comes from resting in Christ who has finished the work on your behalf. There's this Presbyterian theologian, B.B. Warfield, and he has a quote I'd like to read. "There is nothing in us or done by us at any stage of our earthly development because of which we are acceptable to God. We must always be accepted for Christ's sake, or we cannot ever be accepted at all. It is always on his blood and righteousness alone that we can rest." Let me say that again. There is nothing in us or done by us at any stage of our earthly development because of which we are acceptable to God. It is always on his blood and righteousness alone that we can rest. We can rest on the righteousness of Christ. Jesus invites us to rest. Let me read Matthew 11, 28 to 29. This is Jesus speaking. Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Jesus is inviting you to find rest in him. Rest from your labors. Rest from the burden of guilt and shame. Turn from your sin. Place your faith in him. Find forgiveness, freedom, and rest. So what's the point? I think that you should schedule regular times of rest. I think that you should take a Sabbath. You should schedule into your life regular rhythms of rest. See, it's not enough to be willing to rest or to think about God's provision. We are embodied individuals. Like we live in these bodies, and if we don't actually take a break, I don't think the lesson is going to sink in like it's supposed to. If we don't actually rest, I don't think we'll be protected from the idol of work like we need to be. This means plan it out. Set aside time, whether that's weekly or bi-weekly or monthly, set aside whatever fits in your schedule to rest and reflect on the finished work of God. So for me, I try to take my Sabbath day on Mondays. That's the day that I try to set aside from the normal work I do to spend extra time with the Lord and to just rest from the busyness of life. I'm not perfect. I don't do it every week. I try to. That's the goal. The reality is often not that. But that's the rhythm that I have set. Pastor Mark does something similar with Friday evenings to Saturday mornings. And in some seasons, this might be very difficult. The reality is some seasons of life are just busy and you have to work. But I would encourage you to build in these regular rhythms of rest into your schedule. I'd encourage you to sit down and ask yourself, am I working, trying to prove myself to God? Am I turning my work into an idol, or am I resting in him and trusting him? And if it's impossible for you to rest because of the season of life you are in, I would challenge you to ask members of your church to help. A few weeks ago, we preached through chapter 23, and really what I loved about that message that I got to give was this idea that we should offer rest to each other. So if you're at a season of life where you can't take a break, maybe see if someone from this community could watch your kids one night a week or could help you with a chore or something so that you can build some of this rest into your schedule. We are supposed to provide that type of service for each other. And use this time to reflect on the finished work of God. Do things that you find refreshing. Do things that are fun and life-giving, but also make it about Jesus. I had a pastor tell me, I was at a meeting with some other church planters. All of us feel very busy. We all feel very important. And he was busier and more important than all of us, and he told us to take a 20-minute nap a day because God is sovereign. He said, take a 20-minute nap a day to remind yourself that God is on the throne. Personally, I can't do 20 minutes. For me, it's like an hour and a half or nothing. I can't do those many naps. But the point was, if God is sovereign, if he is on the throne, you don't have to be. If he is at work, you don't have to be. You can rest. Remember God's finished work and rest. He finishes his work. Maybe you aren't where you want to be in your walk with the Lord. Maybe you still struggle with that sin that you know you need to give up. Maybe you're still afraid to share your faith. Maybe you don't have the joy or the peace that you want. Remember that God finishes his work. He who has begun a good work in you will carry it to completion. Maybe you're discouraged by the brokenness of the world around you. The crime, the violence, the addiction, the immorality. It seems insurmountable. The darkness seems overwhelming. Well, remember that God finishes his work. He will not leave this world broken. He will make all things new. Maybe you're still carrying the weight of your sin, still trying to justify yourself through your own works. Remember that on the cross, Jesus said, "It is finished," and come to him to find rest. You can rest in the finished work of Christ.